Department of the Air Force for fiscal year 2024. I would like to welcome Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall, Chief of Staff of the Air Force General Charles Brown, and Chief of Space Operations General Chance Saltzman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your leadership, and please share the committee's gratitude with the men and women under your command for their service and to their families for their continued support. The Air Force and Space Force play a fundamental role in our strategic competition with China and other adversaries. The United States air and space power remains the finest in the world, and the entire joint force relies on these capabilities each day. This is a challenging mission, as the Air Force must strike a balance between supporting its continuous global operations while providing adequate resources to modernize its aircraft and maintain our technological edge. To that end, President Biden's defense budget request for fiscal year 2024 includes approximately $260 billion in funding for the Air Force, an increase of $12.4 billion over the 2023 enacted budget. This budget request includes considerable investments in platforms such as advanced battle management systems, Air Force Joint All-Domain Command and Control, next-generation air dominance, the B-21, hypersonics, and air and ground moving target indication. These are important initiatives that will contribute significantly to modernizing the service. Indeed, the Air Force's success in the coming decades will be its ability to manage and control data. The initiatives outlined in this budget would enable the Air Force to detect, analyze, and act on information across the battle space quickly using automation, artificial intelligence, and predictive analytics. In turn, these systems will help our forces acquire targets as early as possible and rapidly deliver information to the best shooter on air, land, or sea. The committee would appreciate an update on these and other programs that are receiving increased emphasis and resourcing. The budget request also proposes to retire or realign various elements of the Air Force with a net reduction of roughly 214 aircraft in fiscal year 2024. This would include reducing or altering the force structure for F-22s, A-10s, F-16s, F-15s, C-130s, KC-135s, KC-10s, J-STARS aircraft, AWACS aircraft, HH-60 helicopters, and training aircraft. Any proposal of this sort deserves careful consideration. Discussions must be had about whether any of these proposed weapon system retirements are necessary or appropriate in the near term. We also need to evaluate our domestic industrial base to avoid making decisions that undercut our production and manufacturing capabilities. I would ask the witnesses to provide us with reasoning for the proposed retirements and assure us that any decisions are well thought out before any changes to the force structure begin. General Saltzman, Congress established the Space Force in order to consolidate the numerous space activities in the Department of Defense. Given that the Space Force is only 3 years old, I understand it is still becoming institutionalized within the department, and there are many challenges in that process. General, I would like to know how you are growing the service in terms of personnel and structures like the Space Development Agency, and how you are working to foster a service culture that can succeed in the dramatically evolving space environment. Finally, now that the Space Force is up and running, it's important to present a trained force with substantive capabilities to the combatant commanders. One of the capabilities for the combatant commands now under discussion is Tactical Space Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance, or ISR. As our satellite constellations and sensors continue to improve, space-based ISR technologies will be able to provide global, continuous information to units operating in every domain. Space is a rapidly evolving domain for the Defense Department. I want to ask the witnesses to discuss what resources are necessary to ensure its success. Secretary Kendall, General Brown, and General Saltzman, thank you again for appearing today. I look forward to your testimony. And as a reminder for my colleagues, there will be a closed session immediately following this hearing in room SVC 217. Let me now turn to the ranking member, Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I join you in welcoming our distinguished witnesses, and I want to thank them for their years of service. This past year has highlighted several growing challenges confronting both the Air Force and the Space Force. For example, Vladimir Putin's brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine has demonstrated the significance of air and missile defense in denying the effective use of air power. Russia maintains a high level of capability in space, but Communist China is much further ahead in comparison. Meanwhile, the state of competition to use or deny the use of space capabilities is rapidly evolving. And Beijing rapidly continues to develop and field capabilities that could test our own assets in the air and in space. Although we face challenges, there are good signs of progress in this year's budget request. For example, I'm encouraged to see the Department of Air Force continue to modernize. In particular, the Air Force is finally building out its fleet of fighter aircraft at a rate much closer to what we need. It does so while continuing to develop the next generation of advanced fighters and bombers. I hope our witnesses will provide an update regarding plans for the next generation of tanker aircraft, considering that the KC-46 delivery is still in progress. I'm also glad to see adequate resourcing for programs such as the Sentinel B-21 and long-range standoff missile. However, there are alarming reports that indicate the ICBM replacement program could be delayed. We simply cannot afford to fall behind on nuclear modernization. So perhaps we'll talk about that. I commend the Space Force for the effort it has put into building a hybrid architecture for missile warning, secure communications, and resilient navigation. I hope our witnesses will identify steps Congress can take to improve space capabilities more rapidly. I'm concerned that the Air Force is still assuming risk in the near term, particularly in the air domain, particularly during the years of concern to operational commanders and the National Defense Strategy, Mr. Secretary. There remains a large gap between warfighting needs and capability. Many of the platforms Congress has supported continue to be delayed, including the F-35 Block 4 upgrades and T-7 trainer aircraft. This is particularly troubling since those delays indicate we may not have these assets to deploy them when we would need them the most. I'm also bothered by, excuse me, I want to have a ringtone here. I'm also bothered by potential failure to accelerate programs such as the E-7 command and control aircraft, despite the clear congressional signal of support last year. Other challenges stand in the way of agile combat employment. To make that a reality, we need to make progress in the electromagnetic spectrum, in munitions production, and in building out the posture of basing and logistics. Further delays in these programs could have disastrous consequences. The Air Force and Space Force have essential roles to play in deterring conflict in the Western Pacific. As I've said in other posture hearings, complacency is not an option. Complacency undermines deterrence. We need to proceed with urgency to get our forces the capabilities they need. So thank you for our witnesses, and I look forward to an important discussion. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Wicker. And now let me recognize the Secretary of the Air Force, Secretary Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Reed.
Could you please pull that microphone as close as possible and ensure it's turned on?
How's that?
Better.
Yeah. Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Wicker, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Department of the Air Force's FY24 budget submission. Approximately 1 year ago, I began my testimony before this committee with a quote from General Douglas MacArthur, reminding us that the history of failure in war can almost always be summed up in 2 words: too late. That warning is even more valid today. Over the past year, under the rubric of 7 Department of the Air Force operational imperatives, the Department of the Air Force has worked to define the capabilities and technologies we need, along with the programs and resources required to deter and, if necessary, prevail over our pacing challenge: China, China, China. In FY24, we are requesting approximately $5 billion as a direct result of this work and over $25 billion for operational imperative-related investments. War is not inevitable, but successfully deterring conflict is heavily dependent on our military capabilities. In our FY24 budget request, there are approximately 20 completely new or significantly rescoped program elements, some of which are classified. that we must develop, produce, and field if we desire to maintain the air and space superiority that America and our allies have counted on for decades. In order to proceed with any of these programs, the Department of the Air Force needs timely authorizations and appropriations. The Department of the Air Force is ready to move forward with the next generation of capabilities we need, and there is no time to lose. In addition to these new starts or enhanced efforts, the FY24 budget includes requests for additional resources to increase production and accelerate development of programs essential to the Department of the Air Force's missions, as defined in the National Defense Strategy. For the strategic triad, we have fully funded the Sentinel ICBM, the B-21 Raider bomber, the long-range standoff weapon, and our nuclear command and control programs. For the conventional force, we are increasing production of both the F-35 and the F-15EX. The Next Generation Air Dominance program is funded to move forward, and as indicated last year, an uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft program of record is fully funded in our FY24 request. We are also continuing the acquisition of sensor programs like the E-7 Wedgetail and the new Resilient Missile Warning and Tracking Space System. As we indicated last year, hard choices have been required to move the department into the future. We deeply appreciate the support of Congress for the divestitures we requested last year. This year, we must continue the divestment of our over 40-year-old A-10 Warthog. This program has served us well, but it is becoming increasingly obsolete and absorbing resources needed for higher priorities. We ask for Congress' continued support for this and other identified changes we must make to field the forces we need to be successful against our pacing and other challenges. But of course, it isn't all about the equipment we need to perform our missions. It's also about the men and women who serve in the total force, active, guard, reserve, and those who support them. We appreciate Congress' support for a 4.6% pay raise last year. This year, we are asking for a 5.2% pay increase, the largest one-year increase we have ever requested. In line with Secretary Austin's Taking Care of People initiative, we are continuing to invest in child development centers and housing to meet the highest priority needs of our airmen, guardians, and their families. Like the other services, with the exception of the Space Force, the Air Force faces challenges in recruiting in a generation where the propensity to serve is the lowest that we've seen in decades. We are removing barriers to service to ensure that anyone with the capability and desire can serve to their full potential. Under the National Defense Strategy, we are also strengthening teams, both in the Joint Force and with our allies and partners. Building these relationships and investing in our ability to work together is the essence of integrated deterrence. The effectiveness and importance of these relationships are on display in Europe today, where NATO is stronger than ever. I recently returned from the Pacific, where I met with a number of our teammates, where I participated in the groundbreaking event for one of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement air bases in the Philippines. Our budget request also supports strengthening our partnerships around the world, especially when we confront our pacing challenge and most acute threats. I started by talking about the value of time, and I'll finish by highlighting a legislative proposal that can save up to 2 years of that valuable time. Our proposal would expand rapid acquisition authority so that military departments can more quickly respond to emerging threats and take advantage of evolving technology. Within reasonable constraints, this legislative proposal would allow progress on compelling national security needs that would otherwise be delayed until the next submission and approval of the President's budget. I've been pushing this reform for many years, and we look forward to working with the Congress on this proposal. In closing, I believe the Department of the Air Force is well postured to move into the future. Our work to define that future is not complete, but has produced compelling results that are reflected in our FY24 budget submission. We look forward to your questions today. We'd like to offer a more complete briefing on the classified details of our submission. And Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to do that after we finish this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. General Brown, please.
Good morning, Chairman Reed and Ranking Member Wicker, and distinguished members of this committee. I'm proud to represent the 689,000 total force airmen serving our nation. I want to thank you for your steadfast support for our airmen and their families. It's an honor to join Secretary Kendall and General Saltzman to testify on the fiscal year 2024 budget submission. This budget builds on the progress made in fiscal year 2023 and marks the next milestone towards the transformation of the Air Force to address the evolving security challenges outlined in the National Defense Strategy. As I emphasized last year, we must continue to accelerate change or risk losing our strategic advantage. The Department of the Air Force's operational imperatives describe key capabilities that must be attained to enable the Air Force's modernization in the face of a rapidly changing threat environment. We remain dedicated to ensuring our investments and resources outlined in this budget submission are aligned with the National Defense Strategy, so the Air Force can continue to deter our adversaries, prevail in conflict, and execute our mission to fight, and win air power anytime, anywhere. Not sometime in some places, but anytime, anywhere. This budget ensures the Air Force continues to provide the nation the assurance of air superiority, the advantage of global strike, the agility of rapid global mobility, and you combine that with the adaptability of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and authority in our command and control capabilities, providing the ability to sense, make sense, and act. This is what we must do today, and we must be prepared to do tomorrow. In order to provide these core functions to the nation, we must accelerate development of programs essential to our mission with this budget submission. To provide the assurance of air superiority, we're increasing production of the F-35 and F-15EX, while the Next Generation Air Dominance Program and Family Assistance continues development. To provide the advantage of global strike, we have fully funded
had a coup.
No, that's
How's that?
much better. Thank you.
That's why he's the
Correct.
Secretary of the Air Force.
No, that's right.
As the FY24 budget will allow us to further efforts to develop a resilient space order of battle and prepare for rapid transition to a wartime posture against any potential adversary to fight and win a high-intensity conflict. In conjunction with ongoing modernization projects, the Space Force has several new starts for FY24 to support those efforts. Investing in these modernization projects will allow us to execute our assigned missions as we move forward to better posture for the emerging complexities of the space domain. Space is now undeniably a contested warfighting domain. China and Russia define space as such and are investing in technology meant to undermine U.S. advantage in the domain. China, our pacing challenge, is our most substantial threat into and from space. But Russia also remains an acute threat. Both present serious challenges with space capabilities that can track and target U.S. military forces on land, at sea, and in the air. Both can hold U.S. space assets at risk with cyber and electronic warfare, lasers, ground-to-space missiles, and space-to-space orbital engagement systems. These systems threaten the space architecture the nation relies on for prosperity and security. To meet this challenge, the Space Force will prioritize 3 lines of effort. First, we will field ready, resilient, and combat-credible forces. Second, we will amplify what I'm calling the Guardian spirit. And third, we will partner to win. These are directly in line with Secretary Austin's mission, people, and team priorities. In sum, this budget request is designed to deliver the forces, personnel, and partnerships the Space Force requires to preserve U.S. advantages in space. To build resilient, ready, combat-credible space forces, we are accelerating the pivot towards modern, more defendable satellite constellations and support infrastructure. We are conducting transformational force design analysis based on threats, operational needs, and costs so that we can maximize our budget while investing in effective missile warning, space domain awareness, communication, and navigation systems. Additionally, we are investing to ensure our networks are hardened to defeat cyber threats and that we have the operational test and training infrastructure necessary to prepare Guardians for high-intensity conflict. With our second line of effort, we are amplifying the Guardian spirit by recruiting, developing, and retaining the best talent and empowering Guardians to succeed. Investment in space-centric curriculum for entry-level schools will build Guardians laser-focused on space operations in both competition and conflict. Guardians will be empowered through Mission Command to innovate and execute in those scenarios. Notably, and with congressional support, we plan to integrate the space mission elements of the Air Force Reserve into the Space Force to offer Guardians flexible career paths, including both full-time and part-time duty, to retain talent and bring private sector experience to the force. The third line of effort acknowledges that the Space Force relies on partnerships to accomplish our mission. We are investing in training, education, data sharing, and integrated capabilities with our allies and partners. The Space Force will strengthen our presence in all combatant commands where Guardians are already making solid connections with allies and partners. Because of its critical importance, the Space Force is collaborating with commercial space partners to build resilient capacity and leveraging emerging technologies. To enhance this partnership, the Space Force is working to eliminate barriers to such collaboration so that we can build enduring advantages and field these capabilities more rapidly. In conclusion, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Space Force's FY24 budget request. The Space Force continues to be the preeminent military space organization in the world. Our adversaries seek to challenge our advantage in space, but with the support of this committee, our Guardians will be able to outwork, out-innovate, and out-compete our potential adversaries to ensure that we maintain that advantage. The FY24 budget request will make this possible, but only if the Congress passes timely appropriations. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, General. I've been informed we have something more than just a microphone issue. We have a system issue, so they're working on it right now. But in the interim, we'll have to share microphones. So you can sit close together or... Let me begin my questioning by touching on a point that was raised by Senator Wicker. That is, the E7, all of my trips to the Pacific particularly have emphasized the importance of getting this system. Last year, we were able to include $200 million extra to accelerate the production, and there was hopes that we would get one aircraft in testing by 2027, but Secretary General Brown, that's what's the earliest point we think we can get the E7 into testing?
We looked hard at trying to accelerate the program, Mr. Chairman, to move the initial stages faster. We didn't find a way to do that. So I think we're basically on track with the same schedule that we showed you last year. The one thing that could be done would be to add funding that would accelerate the production of the follow-on units, not the first one, but the follow-on ones. But we were not able to afford that in our budget.
Now, there was, I think, a presumption that we would buy the Australian version of the E7. They're already flying the aircraft. Have we abandoned that approach?
No, we're still using, there are some modifications that have to be made for use in U.S. airspace and to comply with some of our communications requirements and so on. But they're relatively modest. We're also working with the Australians on follow-on upgrades to the E7 that would enhance its capabilities.
And you're asking for $633 million this year, which will be, as you indicated, to acquire long lead time items and accelerate the production of succeeding aircraft. I mean, again, I think this is absolutely an essential program given what I've heard out in the Pacific. And General Brown, I think, could you concur?
I would, and one of the things I would highlight is that in our relationship with the Australians, we're going to be able to send here in June close to 50 to 60 of our airmen to actually start training on the E7. So when we do get our aircraft, we'll have trained operators and maintainers to help accelerate bringing the E7 into our inventory.
Very good. Another issue is the collaborative combat aircraft, which I think makes a great deal of sense. It, essentially, a manned aircraft would be operating unmanned aircraft. One of the constraints I think we have is the number of missiles available for our aircraft right now, and creating this autonomous capability, multitudes of other aircraft would compound our missile problem. Can you just comment, Mr. Secretary and General Brown, on the missile issue?
We're trying to do a balanced set of investments, and that includes the weapons as well as the platforms. The budget request includes 3 multi-year requests for weapon systems for missiles, for AMRAAM, JASSM, and the LRASM. We're also trying to increase the production capacity of the JADM when we get it into production. So we added, I think, about $1.5 billion for munitions procurement in this budget over last year's, just for the reasons that you stated.
Thank you. General Brown, any further comments?
That extra funding will help to facilitate, so we actually, as we hit funding, we can actually increase the production rate, not only for AMRAAM, but JADM, which is the follow-on to AMRAAM, is also going to be an important aspect to support the collaborative combat aircraft.
And this is sent a positive signal to the industrial base that you're here for the long run?
Absolutely.
That's correct.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Saltzman, you referred to this in your testimony, but can you give us a quick update on the status, and please try your microphone. I think.
Did it work?
Oh, wow.
Thank you. It was the Air Force and the Space Force that combined in a few seconds and fixed it, so here we go. Question. Test and training ranges. You're at a point now where you have to develop them. They'll be quite different than hundreds of acres of land someplace in the Midwest or the Far West. Can you give us an idea of where you are on your range and your infrastructure for range and testing?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Senator. We of course have simulators, and we have some very nascent early models of what I'll call virtual ranges to accomplish our training. I just don't think they're sufficient yet, and primarily because they don't replicate the threat effectively. And so the budget proposal adds several $100 million, about $340 million across the FIDEP, in order to increase the fidelity of our simulators and allow us to inject threats into the environment so that our crews can validate their tactics and validate their training against a thinking adversary.
Thank you very much. Senator Wicker, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Secretary Kendall, thank you for starting off with the MacArthur quote about too late. It does segue right into a number of things I mentioned in my opening statement, sir. The ICBM replacement program could be delayed. that would cause us to fall farther behind on nuclear modernization. Delays in the F-35 Block 4 upgrades, the T-17 trainer aircraft, and then the chairman has already gone into the E-7 command and control aircraft, which would replace the 1975 era AWACS. What happened to the $200 million that we provided last year to accelerate this program, which ended up not getting accelerated?
So you're referring to the E-7?
Yes, the E-7 command and control aircraft. I'm sorry, did I not make that clear?
That program has been moving as fast as we're able to move it. I did a personal review of the steps that are necessary to get it into the first phase of testing, and we couldn't find a way to do that. I'm not sure about the $200 million that you're referring to and what was done with that.
All right. Well, the chairman mentioned in his question that at the Air Force's request, we provided. We appropriated another $200 million above the president's budget request to accelerate this program. It did not get accelerated, and we wonder where the $200 million went. And then there's a larger question that the chairman alluded to. There is the E-7 Wedgetail that's being used by our allies in Australia. That's being used very effectively by them. And so, General Brown, do you know where the $200 million went?
Some of that aspect, that money went into the initial development and getting things on contract to start, also the long lead items to develop the aircraft.
Okay. Well, now, Secretary Kendall was asked when this E-7 will now be ready, and I don't think we got an answer to that, Secretary Kendall. You said it would just still be on the original schedule. When will that be ready?
2027 is the year we fill in. It takes 2 years to build the new airplane, then we have to take another 2 years roughly to modify it and put it into testing. So the first aircraft will be ready in 2027.
Why is it necessary for an aircraft that's already functioning well for one of our allies?
Because we are getting new production aircraft. So their commercial aircraft were then modified to put the radar system and the command and control systems inside them. So in order to preserve airworthiness, you have to actually acquire the commercial aircraft and then open it up to insert the other things that you need to put in it.
Okay, but
that whole process takes a period of time.
Okay. Well, it is a fact, though, that Congress, at the request of the service, provided an extra $200 million for acceleration, and we didn't get any acceleration. That is correct, is it not?
I think, as General Brown indicated, what you got with that was some long lead items being purchased to reduce risk in the program.
We didn't get any acceleration, did we?
I'd have to check that for the record. I'm not aware that you got acceleration.
You get back to us on the record. How, Secretary Brown, how important is this T-7 air training aircraft, and to what sort of a disadvantage are we at that this has been delayed once again?
The importance of the T-7 is it's a replacement aircraft for a 60s era T-38 aircraft, and so as we bring that on, one of our challenges is continue the maintainability of the T-38 with the delays that right now we have with the T-7. So it's a better aircraft. The T-7 is a better aircraft. We've had a chance to personally fly in the simulator to see how it operates. But it's going to help us produce our pilots at a, because of the glass cockpit as well, at a better rate and to be able to transition to the current capabilities we have today.
Another delay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Sheen, please.
Could I clarify a point for Senator Wicker? When we have talked about acceleration of E-7, generally we have talked about getting more inventory sooner, not getting the first airplane sooner. So I think there may be some confusion because of the way we've used the word accelerate. We get more inventory in the hands of people faster than we would have with the profile we initially proposed, but you don't get the first airplane faster.
Inventory. What do you mean by that?
Instead of going a profile of 1, 2, 3, for example, we go 1, 3, 3. So you get additional aircraft sooner than you would have otherwise. So the total deliveries are accelerated, but not the first aircraft.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Secretary. Senator Sheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kendall and General Brand, Secretary Kendall, you talked about timely authorizations and appropriations in your opening statement, and General Brand, you also referred to on-time appropriations as being critical. What will happen to your role, the role of the Air Force and the Space Force, for that matter, if the United States defaults on its debt?
That's a very big question, Senator. I'm not an economist. I'm trained in business. For any creditor to default on their debt causes a number of reactions, right? It's more expensive for you to get money. Your creditors aren't as willing to lend money. People are not as willing to lend money to you. All the economists that I've seen suggest that it will be an absolutely devastating impact. When you have, the closest thing I've seen to this is the 2008 crisis, when the Congress was asked to pass several $100 billion of funds to shore up the financial system. And I remember watching the screen as the stock market completely collapsed as that bill was being voted down in the Congress. That's the sort of thing that we're talking about. And I think most people would predict a severe recession at least, and then going forward, one of the biggest parts of our federal budget is the interest on the debt. If those interest rates go up, which is what happens to you when you default, if you can borrow money at all, then that expense becomes much greater. And the interest on the debt is already roughly at the level of the defense budget. So the short answer to your question is it would be devastating.
And you talked about the threat from China, which I think we would all agree is our major competitor. What would China's reaction be to that kind of catastrophic financial outcome in the United States?
That's probably beyond my expertise to comment on intelligently, but obviously anything that damages us would be a benefit to China.
Thank you. So it's probably not good for us to default on our debt.
That's a significant understatement, I think.
Thank you. General Brand, during the recent appearance before the Appropriations Defense Subcommittee, we had a conversation about the deficiency with the KC-46's load guidance system, and you said you had not heard anything about that. Have you had a chance to look into that, and do you have an answer for what the impact of that will be?
I regret that I haven't been able to dig into the details on that, but just in my conversations with our operators, also with AMC, the aircraft is performing fairly well right now, despite some of the deficiencies that we're finding. And it, as I think I've highlighted to you before, is it's operating and supporting all of our aircraft with the exception of the A-10.
Well, I will continue to ask you, so hopefully you'll be able to get an answer for how that's affecting the operations of the KC-46. General Saltzman, in Ukraine, we've seen the role of commercial satellite companies and how important those are. And obviously, that's going to continue to be critical in terms of the Space Force. You talked a little bit about the training and how to incorporate addressing dealing with those commercial satellites. Can you talk about how important it is to adapt our training and to really make use of the commercial innovation that's going on?
One of the areas that I think is ripe for exploitation is the idea of virtual augmentation or virtual reality as we've seen it. And there's a lot of very promising technologies associated with how you could do virtually augmented reality training so that the operators can experience something that day-to-day they don't get to experience in space. Sometimes the orbital mechanics are hard to visualize, but you can use these tools to help you understand proximity between spacecraft, proximity of how solar arrays are turned. So there's a lot of exploitation that we can do with those kinds of technologies, and we're looking into those with commercial industry.
Good. I've actually had one of those demonstrations. They're very impressive. You also, General Saltzman, talked about the opportunities for full and part-time availability in Space Force to bring private sector talent to the force. As the co-chair of the National Guard Caucus, I know that the National Guard has a lot of interest in participating in Space Force in some capacity, and there's still a fair amount of confusion about how that's going to work. Can you talk about the progress that we've made on how we're going to incorporate the National Guard into Space Force?
Well, it's two different things at this juncture. First is the legislative proposal that we've put forward that helps establish the Air Force Reserve space elements into the Space Force proper, a single component that would have both full-time and part-time. We think that's a very innovative way to establish this career path flexibility that will have retention impacts for us. The second situation is the Space National Guard or the Air National Guard capabilities that are performing space. Separate and distinct from the proposal, the most important thing to me is that we retain the capabilities that are currently in the Air National Guard. It's about 1,000 people. It's 7 different states with tremendous space capabilities that we rely on every day. And so it's important that we maintain that expertise and those capabilities. What we've said is there's probably multiple ways where we can retain those, but we have to move away from the status quo because we've got this disconnect between my responsibilities for the mission, but General Brown's responsibilities to currently OT&E those space capabilities in the Air National Guard. So where status quo causes problems, there are other ways to evaluate those, and we're going through all the costing and analysis to make sure that we can provide decision makers with the right balance between the two.
Well, thank you. I look forward to hearing the outcome of those discussions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sheen. Senator Fisher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to ask you about an underappreciated but absolutely integral part of our nuclear enterprise, and that's NC3 modernizations. Senator King often refers to that as the fourth leg of our triad, and I agree with him on the absolute importance of that. Can you please describe how this budget request supports NC3 modernization and why it is so important that we get this effort right?
Thank you, Senator. The NC3 is an essential part of the triad. It actually has to be secure and resilient so they can function in an emergency. What we're doing is we're replacing and getting to the next generation of AEHF satellites for secure communications. We're investing in that. We're also investing in the radios that are carried by some of our aircraft that are nuclear capable. And we're investing in some of our software systems that are used to manage nuclear functions. So we have fully funded investment accounts in each of those areas to make sure we stay current and provide the secure nuclear communications that are necessary.
Would you say we're on schedule in that modernization? Do you feel pretty confident that we're where we need to be?
I'm never 100% confident in schedules. Every new program, every development program in particular entails risk. I'm not aware of anything there's nothing that's keeping me up at night in that area right now.
Okay, good to hear. General Brown, I'd like to ask you about the Sentinel program. The Sentinel emplacement is one of the largest and most complex projects that the department has undertaken in decades. What efforts are currently being undertaken to ensure that this program remains on schedule?
There are several things that we're doing to keep Sentinel on schedule, and part of that is the dialogue between the Department of the Air Force with our industry partners. I meet with the CEO on a quarterly basis where we walk through where they are. One of the key aspects we're looking at is trying to be more proactive than reactive on this and really thinking ahead to ensure we're doing things to drive down risk to, as far as supply chains, workforce, to stay ahead of. And then on top of that is we're working to do right now the land acquisition, working that process as well. So right now, I think the dialogue is important, and that's what's really helping us keep things on track so that there are no surprises or minimize the surprises and being able to engage and mitigate well in advance of any type of event that might impact the critical path.
As you look ahead and you're talking about mitigation on disruptions that can occur, what keeps you up at night?
Well, just the size of the size of this particular program and the aspect of how important it is to our strategic deterrence. Because of the size of the program and the time length it's going to take, those are the things that concern me because there's a lot of things that could happen between now and we fully filled. But our goal here is to stay ahead of those and ensure we mitigate any type of challenges.
Are we on track for that goal?
We are now, and that's part of the hard work between ourselves and our industry partners.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Kendall, I was with you on the rollout for the B-21 Raider. Can you provide us with any updates or new developments on that program?
There haven't been any fundamental changes since we were there, Senator. We're still, as far as I know, on track to have first flight later this year.
And can you tell me how the budget request this year is going to help to expand munitions production capacity?
Yeah, we're asking for multi-year production for 3 systems, JASSM, LRASM, and AMRAAM. We're also entering production, hopefully, for JATM, the new air missile, and we're going to be asking for funds to increase the size of that production line, the capacity of that production line, from what we had originally planned.
Okay, good. Also, Secretary Kendall and General Brown, I was pleased to see that there's full funding for the RC-135 program in the budget request for this year. The RC-135 is highly capable IRS platform that provides critical intelligence to decision makers and enables the United States to maintain a strategic advantage over potential adversaries. We see those efforts and how important they are in Ukraine and also with our NATO allies. Thank you for getting that in there, and I expect to see continued full support for the RC-135 fleet in future years as well. So thank you both very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator King, please.
Thank you. Secretary Kendall, which do you consider a more serious immediate threat to national security, China or the failure of this Congress to pass a budget and go with a one-year continuing resolution?
They're not in the same category, Senator, but I take your point. I mentioned time in my opening statement. It's the thing that I'm most obsessed about. We can't get it back. It's irreplaceable.
And how serious would it be if we had a year-long continuing resolution instead of the passage of a budget?
It would be very serious. All the new starts that I talked about earlier, all the increased efforts that I talked about, all the work. We spent a year roughly working on what we call operational imperatives, which were the 7 operational problems that we needed to solve given what the threat is doing, particularly China.
Would it compromise national security?
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier, and this is sort of in the same lane, in your testimony, in your opening statement about an advanced procurement or an advanced approval for some of the work that you're undertaking. Could you expand on that a bit?
Senator King, you're of an age similar to mine, and I think when I make a reference to the movie Casablanca, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the movie starts...
I'm shocked that there's going on here.
The movie starts with a comment about refugees who come to Casablanca and wait and wait and wait. I'm waiting right now. We spent the first year I was in office defining what we needed to do to stay ahead of the basing challenge, ahead of China. And I had to wait a year to get that into the budget, get the budget submitted. Now I'm waiting another roughly a year for, under normal circumstances, that budget to be passed. If there's a year continuing resolution, I'll wait yet another year. And that is all time that we're giving away to someone who's racing to be ahead of us technologically in field of capability. We cannot afford that time.
And you're proposing a technique and a budgetary
what I'm proposing is
that
we wouldn't have to wait even the normal one year and a half. We will be able to do the low-cost initial stages of a program, do the system engineering, do the preliminary design work, do maybe a little risk reduction, maintain competition, make no long-term commitments, only go up to the point of preliminary design review, one of the earliest milestones. All that is relatively inexpensive, but it takes time. And then Congress would have full authority to decide whether we could proceed beyond that point or not. We would probably use reprogrammings for this, and Congress would have authority over that. So there wouldn't be any real loss of the authorities that the Congress has over what we do, but we will gain a year and a half at least of time, lead time to getting things fielded.
We're headed for a markup of the National Defense Authorization Act in about a month. I hope that you'll submit your suggestion so that we can consider it as part of that process.
It's been submitted, Senator. It came over from OMB. It was approved by OMB.
So it's
you have it
in our process.
Yes.
Thank you. General Brown, Senator Kramer and I submitted a letter some time ago to the uniformed leadership about the transition program in the military from active duty to veteran status. We got a response from the Secretary, but I view this as a uniformed issue. I want the senior leadership to take this issue very seriously. Transition for veterans is an incredibly important situation because we've learned that suicide, for example, is most likely in the first 2 or 3 years after separation. So I hope I can have your commitment to pay particular attention to this process. We should be attending to be sure that our soon-to-be veterans have all the information and contacts that they need to reintegrate into the larger society.
You have my commitment, and I do take it very seriously because, as you might imagine, I have a number of friends that have served, and then at some point I will also transition into as a veteran. So, the aspect of how we do a very smooth handoff in collaboration with the Veterans Affairs, but it's not only how we transition into new careers, it's also how they emotionally transition into a new life out of uniform, and I think that's a key aspect that helps. If we focus on that, I think that will also help us prevent the suicides of our veterans.
Thank you. I'll be submitting a question for the record in the classified session with regard to a GPS-denied environment. I think that's something we really need to pay close attention to. The first step in any conflict is going to be an attempt to blind us. So I hope that and I have the same recommendation to the Navy that they relearn how to use sextants. Space Guard, General Saltzman, where does that stand? We've been discussing that on the committee. What's your recommendation with regard to a reserve force or Space Guard to augment the capabilities of your organization?
My recommendation at this point is to make sure we have good validated numbers that can help us assess each of the various courses of action that would allow me to retain the kinds of capabilities that currently live inside the Air National Guard. Again, that's my most important point. The expertise and the capabilities that are currently in the Air National Guard need to be harvested so we don't create an operational gap in any kind of transition. So my recommendation is make sure that the costing, the number of billets, all of that data is assessed and evaluated as we look at the course of actions.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Cotton, please.
Gentlemen, thank you for your appearance here and your decades of service to our nation. Secretary Kendall, you've spoken some about accepting near-term risk to fund the future force. I've gone back and looked historically at Air Force budgets for about 20 years. Are you aware that the Air Force has received $1.3 trillion less than the Army since 2002?
I was not aware of that.
And almost $1 trillion less than the Navy since 2002?
No, I was not aware of that either, Senator.
That's after accounting for the so-called pass-through budget, which I believe causes many people, to include members of Congress, to misperceive the Air Force's total budget. Could you share with us your thoughts about how that works?
The pass-through budget is budget that's included in the submission under the Department of the Air Force, but it's money that doesn't actually go to the Air Force. It's about $40 billion. For people who are familiar with the budget and used to working with it, understand that, and they realize what that is. So for people who are not as familiar, it can be a little confusing in terms of what our total budget is.
And to be clear, this pass-through budget is not for Air Force classified programs, or not only for Air Force classified programs. It's simply your budget is used as the vehicle to fund these other programs.
That's correct. It goes to different departments.
That's why I say I think some people misperceive the top-line Air Force budget, and I worry that that might be contributing in part to why your service has had to accept this near-term risk now to fund the future force. And I think we as a Congress should try to address this situation to make sure this misperception doesn't continue?
Senator, what I look at is the adequacy of our budget to allow us to meet our missions. And I'm comfortable with the money that we're asking for this year to be able to do those functions. There is risk always, and we've tried to balance that risk, taking into account the pacing challenge in particular and trying to respond to that.
I want to return to both your opening statement and a question from Senator Reed about collaborative combat aircraft, or CCAs. You called them. Can you significance these CCAs are for both deterrence and your combat capability?
Our analysis shows that they're very cost effective, that they basically, by augmenting crewed aircraft with relatively inexpensive CCAs, you get a net combat capability, which is much more significant than if you tried to do it with all fully crewed aircraft. And our current anticipation is that the cost of a CCA will be a fraction of the cost of, say, an F-35. The other advantage is for overall affordability. It can make the force much more affordable. You get a lot more combat power for the same total dollars that you might be committing. So it has big benefits in both ways.
And you said again today in your opening statement that the history of failure in warfare can almost always be summed up in 2 words: too late. A famous Douglas MacArthur quote, but I think you've said it enough that maybe one legacy of your tenure is that people will think it's a Frank Kendall quote. And I think that's apt today as it was in MacArthur's time. What would be the significance if China were to field such unmanned aircraft along with its manned fleet before the United States? And how could delays in CCA funding impact that possibility?
China is aggressively trying to field the capability to defeat our ability to project power. And they've been working on it for at least 20 years. Their long-range weapon systems targeting our airfields, our carriers, our satellites, et cetera, are a threat that we really have to cope with. But they're also modernizing their air-to-air capability. And I think, Senator Cotton, you've seen the classified briefing that we've been providing. I can't go into great details here, but they have analyzed carefully how we fight and what we fight with, and they've been thoughtful about what they need to invest in to try to circumvent that or defeat it. And that's the reason that I'm so obsessed with getting on with the next generation capabilities. Holding on to things that are becoming obsolete over time just doesn't make any sense. We've got to get to the next generation.
Okay, and it's my understanding that this fleet of unmanned aircraft would be a mix of aircraft with both weapons, kinetic weapons, let's say, missiles, bombs, that sort of thing, but also other sensors or electronic warfare systems. Is that correct, Mr. Secretary?
Yeah, that's correct. One way to think about it is that the pod or the weapon that might have been under the wing of a crewed aircraft is now flying in separate aircraft and managed by that commander of that aircraft. The analysis that we've done shows that the adversary has to honor each of those aircraft as it is a full threat. And that gives you a great advantage relative to the cost of having those things in the air.
So it creates a targeting problem for our adversary to have so many aircraft up in the air.
It both increases the targeting problem, but also gives him tactical dilemmas that he doesn't have to face right now. We can sacrifice one of these aircraft, put it well out in front, use it to draw fire, and force the other side to expose itself and then be subject to engagement. So we call them attritable. They're not expendable, but we can afford to lose some of them operationally. There's nobody in them that we're going to lose. So it changes our tactical options substantially.
While therefore enhancing survivability of our manned aircraft.
Exactly right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Hirono, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam faces significant infrastructure challenges due to consistently deferred maintenance. For the Air Force specifically, Hickam Airfield is in urgent need of almost $1 billion over the next several years to repair the taxiways our planes take off and land on. Secretary Kendall, is this budget request adequately prioritizing maintaining Air Force facilities in the Pacific?
We are prioritizing our facilities in the Pacific largely because of the threat that we face out there. And one of the operational imperatives was resilient forward basing. So the thing that we're prioritizing is improving the hardening and the equipage, if you will, of our bases so that we can make agile combat employment a reality. I believe that Hickam specifically falls under a joint base construct,
yes,
where it's operated by the Navy. and we're working with the Navy to try to have our priorities funded.
That's why I have a question for General Brown. Repairing the Hickam Airfield will require support from the Navy and the Joint Base. Are there issues prioritizing Air Force needs at the Joint Base? General Brown.
Having served as the commander of Pacific Air Forces and being stationed there at the Joint Base, there has to be collaboration between the Air Force and the Navy. We've been able to highlight more recently our real concerns with the airfield pavement, and so it's gotten the attention of the Navy and other parts of the department. So I think we're on a good path to actually ensure that aspect, because it's going to help us project combat power.
Thank you. The Agile Combat Employment Strategy requires the appropriate posture and supporting infrastructure at locations throughout the Pacific, like the islands of the Compact of Freely Associated States. That would be Palau, Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Guam, and Northern Australia. Secretary Kendall, does the Air Force have the appropriate forward air basing it needs to execute Agile Combat Employment?
We're working to increase that air basing in places that you mentioned, in Japan, wherever we're based in the Pacific. Our operational success out there depends on making the concept of agile combat employment a reality. And that includes, and it's a priority for us in the budget, because it's something we can do fairly quickly relative to other things that we might want to do that would take a development program, for example. So we do have quite a bit of money in the budget focused on adding capability to support agile combat employment, including in the locations that you just mentioned, Senator.
General Brown, what would be the impact to deterrence capabilities in the Pacific if dispersed infrastructure in the places that I'm mentioning are not prioritized?
It decreases our options. And by having more and more options to be able to operate, that complicates the calculus for our adversaries. And by having and being able to show different locations we can operate from, project combat power from, a credible combat force, that adds to deterrence. And having that ability is important.
I'm sure both of you acknowledge the importance of the compacts of free association that we are currently concluding. And I just want the two of you to be aware that not only should we be funding the appropriate amounts to the compact nations themselves, but when their citizens come to our country and they are living in states throughout the U.S., that they are able to access the social service programs that they should be entitled to. And I would like those kinds of provisions to be included in the compact. And I'm mentioning this to you because the compacts involve not just the DOD, but Interior as well as state. General Saltzman, the Department of Defense is increasingly turning to space-based systems for its ballistic cruise and hypersonic missile defense sensing needs. This is of particular interest to Hawaii. So what are you doing to ensure that these programs remain on time and on budget? And also, these space systems come with their own unique risks. How is the Space Force ensuring these capabilities are resilient in the face of disruption, whether through cyber or kinetic attack?
Yes, Senator, I think you'll see that this particular budget submission addresses those concerns. First, the missile warning, missile tracking layer that we are pivoting to is a proliferated constellation, which means it's more resilient by design. There are more satellites performing the mission. Because they are in lower Earth orbit, they're actually more high fidelity, so it's better tracking for some of the threats that we're seeing come out of our pacing challenge. Also, we are investing heavily in the cyber defense capabilities of the networks that are required to maintain and operate those systems as well. So this budget definitely addresses your concerns.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reynolds. Senator Rounds, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, first of all, thank you all, to you and to your families, for your service to our country. I'd also like to thank General Brown and Secretary Kendall for your most recent visit to Ellsworth Air Force Base. Ellsworth is very excited to be the first bed down for the B-21 training squadron and the first operational squadron, and the entire community, and in fact, the entire state of South Dakota is very excited to see that coming their way. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize the Tigers of the 37th Bomb Squadron in their recent win of the STRATCOM's coveted Omaha Trophy.
shows that they are the best of the best, and we're proud of them. General Brown and General Saltzman, there have been efforts most recently regarding an attempt to utilize a part of the magnetic or the electromagnetic spectrum for purposes other than DoD purposes, and specifically the 3.1 to 3.45 gigahertz band, or the S band, of the spectrum. I'd like, for the record, if you could confirm for us that your forces do utilize that portion of the spectrum, and that at this unclassified level, could you share with us just how significant that part of the spectrum is to your forces regarding radar communications and so forth? General Brown?
Senator Rounds, we do use that part of the spectrum for our operational capabilities. And there's a number of weapon systems that operate within that band. I'll just give you one example, our C-130 station keeping. If that band was actually moved and we had to redesign, it would cost us roughly about $2 billion just for that one platform. And we have a number of platforms that operate within that within the S-band. So it's critical that we understand the impact on national security, not only for us to be able to operate, but also having to if we had to redesign systems, if we lost access to that part of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Thank you, General. General Saltzman?
We have that particular band is a radar band that allows us to look into deep space. And we currently have a developmental radar that's going to significantly enhance our ability to do space domain awareness. If we were not able to use that piece of spectrum, not only would we lose the time that we've already invested in as much as several $100 million that we've already put into development, but it would also mean that we have to use a different portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, which isn't as capable in determining and discriminating capabilities in deep space.
Physics still count, don't they?
They do, sir.
Thank you. General Brown, multiple independent studies, as well as at least one by the Air Force, indicate the numbers of bombers needed to meet requirements greatly exceeds the minimum number currently being planned for. In your professional military judgment, what is the approximate number of bombers needed to maintain a credible deterrent against two near-peer competitors?
Senator, the couple things I think about is not only the number, but also the capability of the bombers. And the two bombers that we're right now, a three-bomber fleet going to a two-bomber fleet, the B-21, as you highlighted, that will start out at Ellsworth, but also as we upgrade the B-52. And so there'll be 100 B-21s and 75 B-52s. We will continue to do analysis. I mean, that's what the analysis we have right now based on the threat. We will continue to pay attention to the threat. And that will also influence if we have to go beyond those numbers from a bomber capacity standpoint.
It sounds like a lot of bombers until you realize that not all of them are capable at all time. They're all undergoing maintenance at one point or another. What percentage of the bombers would you normally expect to be operational at that point?
Ideally, when we look at our day-to-day operations, not only for our bombers, but really all of our fleet, an 80% aircraft availability, because you're going to have some aircraft down for maintenance, down for depot, type operations. That's the goal of what we want to get to or above, not only for our bombers, but really across all of our platforms.
Thank you, sir. General Saltzman, as you know, I have concerns about the DoD's approach to providing space-based ground-moving target indication capabilities to tactical DoD users following the divestment of the JSTARS platform. Can you share with me how you are making sure that the JROC validated requirements are captured in the acquisitions process of a platform whose acquisition is executed by the intelligence community, and will the DoD maintain milestone authority?
Currently, milestone decision authority, obviously that's acquisitions, and it'll be a collaborative effort with the IC, but Mr. LaPlante in USD A&S does have that milestone decision authority, or portions of it. From my vantage point, in terms of requirements and meeting those requirements, the Space Force is responsible for writing the capabilities development document, which documents those high-level requirements to make sure that the JROC validated requirements are satisfied in the program. And then perhaps most importantly is the concept of employment. U.S. Space Force has responsibility to write that concept of employment to make sure that operationally it's a DoD mission that meets the warfighter requirements regardless of who develops the sensor.
Thank you. And Secretary Kendall, just one very quick comment. I hope that in the future, with the help of this committee, when asked what keeps you up at night, I hope there will be a point here shortly where you can respond the same way that Secretary Mathis did, Secretary of Defense Mathis did, and said, it's not things that keep me up at night, I keep other people up at night. And I think that's our goal. Thank you.
I share that with you, Senator.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Round. Senator Ernst, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony and your service to our great nation. I want to continue the discussion about our bomber force and the future of it. And in a conflict with China, Air Force bombers will need to go after hundreds of targets over the vast distances of the Pacific, and yet today's Air Force is very much centered on fighters, with about 15 fighters for every one of our bombers. If you look back to the 1960s, the Air Force had to deliver long-range strikes against the Soviets, and the makeup of the Air Force at that time was about 3 fighters to every bomber. So we just need to make sure that the mix is appropriate for today's fight. And again, if we're looking at a fight with China, we want to make sure that we're appropriately balanced. So General Brown, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit more about the critical role of the bomber in projecting power, especially as we're looking towards the east and a potential fight with China.
Yeah, well, excuse me. One of the key areas that when you think about our bomber fleet, it's to be able to do come from long distances away from where the airfields that they would take off from would be under attack by and large. The overall capacity of our bombers to do a number of missions will be able to carry, how long they'll be able to stay airborne. And so it provides that capability to carry a number of long-range standoff weapons in support of operations. That's the viability of the bomber, and it's the capability that it provides to be able to help us generate combat power.
Yeah, very important. Thank you, sir. And to the extent you can speak to it, how would the B-21's modular design allow the bomber to take on a wider range of missions, whether it's a strike mission, ISR, or even electronic warfare?
I think one of the areas as we start really going down the path of our digital engineering and looking at how we do mission systems, many things are more software-based today than they were back in history. And so that ability to be able to rapidly reprogram vis-a-vis the threat, to bring in additional capability from a weapons standpoint as well, that's a part of the modular aspect and how we're able to work the aspects of the digital engineering to bring in capability much faster than we have in the past. Yeah,
exactly. I'm intrigued by modular designs in this platform and many others as well. Secretary Kendall, without major increases in the Air Force budget, then would increasing the B-21 buy require divesting legacy aircraft?
Senator, I share your concern about the future size and structure of the Air Force. I'm not sure that the future Air Force will look all that much like the one we have today. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that may change is the shift in the balance that you talked about between shorter range tactical air capabilities and longer range strike capabilities the bombers provide. Within whatever constraint we have, we will probably end up, I think, at some point talking about adjustments to what the current ratio is. We don't have many options to make those changes right now. We're preserving the bomber fleet pretty much as we can. We're fortunate that the B-52 was so robustly designed that we can keep it pretty much forever. So we're using it as a bus essentially, and we keep upgrading it, putting new engines on it, new radar. The B-1 continues to service. It's got a lot of capacity. The B-2s are been harder to maintain. B-21 is our option in the near term to bring in new capability, and we're just starting to get it into production. The current number is 100. I don't know what it will end up being. It may be larger than that. I would not be surprised by that.
And Secretary, thank you for that. Is there a way that the Air Force could control unit costs if it ramps up production of the B-21?
Cost and quantity are always connected, and you do reduce cost by increasing the production rate, definitely. Okay. The B-21 is being built on on a line that was built for the development program and just be continued to use for production at a relatively modest rate. I think if we were going to significantly increase the production, we'd have to go relook at how we were tooled for manufacturing the B-21. But that's not a near-term decision.
Wow. Well, I appreciate it, gentlemen. My grandfather built bombers in Middle America during World War II, and it's amazing that here we are all those years later, and yet we're still heavily reliant upon its capabilities. But thank you all very much for being here today. Thank you for your service.
Thank you, Senator Ernst. Senator Kramer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for your service and for being with us today. Since bombers are the topic of the moment, General Brown, I want to talk a little bit about not so much bombers, but disbursement of bombers and taking advantage of some opportunities, particularly as it relates to BASE, or Bomber Agile Combat Employment, and the distribution of the nuclear capabilities. As you know, of course, there used to be 6 big bases in the northern tier between Michigan and Montana. Today there are 2, and one of them being Minot, the other one being Grand Forks in North Dakota. The Grand Forks, of course, was a bomber base. It had a 300-foot wide runway. It's been reduced to a 150-foot runway based on the movement of the lights. It's due for improvement in 2025, and I'm just wondering if you'd be open to looking carefully at perhaps widening that runway for, base type of use in the future. Again, keeping in mind that in 2025 it's due for some improvements anyway, because like I said, we're down to the last 2 in that tier.
Senator, we can definitely look at that, particularly as you said that they're already going to be doing some modifications. It's probably, anytime you're doing that, it's probably a good time to take a look at it and make sure we do not miss any options to provide us opportunities and capabilities in the future.
Well, I always like it when my state's interests match up with common sense and the military, so all I can ask is that you take a good look at it. Thank you. General Brown, I also want to talk to you about, you and I a couple of years ago talked about the deliveries of the MH-139A helicopters. Secretary Kendall happened to be in Minot around Christmas time, and so he saw those drafty old Vietnam-era helicopters that our airmen, and particularly security forces, have to use in Minot. And we couldn't go for a ride that day because of weather, not uncommon in Minot. The delay at that time, a couple of years ago, the delay in delivery was due to FAA certification, as you no doubt recall and know. That's now done, but we see that there may be a delay again. And I'm just wondering if you have some sort of an update on the MH-139As and when we might expect to see them.
Yeah, we just finished up the production development phase, and then in FY24, we expected 4 of the MH-139s to start their initial operational testing. So we'll be beyond that FAA certification, and then that'll help us start the path of a follow-on procurement to start filling the aircraft.
Well, is 4 enough? I mean, is there a way to escalate that? Is there any chance we could accelerate that? And, I mean, I'd even question whether the Hueys, the old ones, are mission capable at this point.
Well, we'll always take a look to see if there's ways to accelerate, bringing on a capability, and at the same time balance the risk as we bring that capability on to the force.
I understand. Maybe one of the things that could help inspire you would be a ride in February. But anyway, we'll work on that. We'll work on that another time. Thank you very much. Thank you, all 3 of you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Senator Kramer. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being here today. Gentlemen, in your service, General Saltzman, U.S. policy is to have at least 2 space launch vehicles to launch DOD and NRO satellites. Space has changed a lot in 20 years. That law was written in 2004. Meanwhile, the demand for launch vehicles, commercial, civil, and defense has skyrocketed. Given the dramatic changes that have occurred in space, the increase in demand and the need for greater resiliency, redundancy, and responsiveness, what would be your best military advice for policymakers when it comes to space launch vehicles? Would you like to see at least 3?
Well, assured access to space is a critical capability that we have. The way I would characterize it is for me to say that we have assured access to space, I need at least 2 providers capable of putting satellites on orbit. But it's to the advantage of the U.S. government, it's to the advantage of the U.S. Space Force to have as many viable launch providers as possible. It creates a level of agility, it creates a level of resiliency that's important, which is why our NSSL, National Security Space Launch Phase 3 contract that we have out for comments is looking at 2 lanes. One that maximizes the number of emerging launch providers to participate while preserving that assured access, our most highly risk-averse mission sets. And so I think we've struck that balance appropriately.
Thank you. Secretary Kendall, the U.S. Air Force wants its next generation aero refueler tanker KCZ to reach initial operational capabilities by 2040. Clearly that creates a gap in critical wartime capability. Where are we on the KC-46 Pegasus procurement to ensure we have full capabilities?
Senator Tuberville, we've fundamentally changed our tanker acquisition strategy. We need to move to a next generation of tanking capability, which is resilient enough to survive against the pacing challenge. So basically, the current plan is to go from the KC-46 into what we call the next generation aerial refueling system, or NGAS, which will be a new design designed to be resilient enough to survive in the environment that we anticipate. We want to get to that design as quickly as we can. So there will be some gap between the currently contractual options that we have for KC-46 to when we can get the NGAS system into production. We'd like to make that gap as small as possible. So what we're requesting in this budget is the funding to start down the road towards this program and do the analysis of alternatives to define that design and its requirements. But we need to get on with this as quickly as we can. It's one of the areas in which time is very important to us. It won't be 2040. It's going to be much sooner than that. But we don't know how, until we define the design and move it forward, we don't know exactly what that date will be. I'm shooting for the early 2030s.
General Brown, your thoughts on that?
As the Secretary described, our tankers are very important to be able to generate that combat power, and the aspect of it, by changing the strategy to move things further left and to get to next generation air refueling system is a way to move a bit faster to provide that capability. It's going to be a bit more survivable and be able to create greater combat power.
Yeah, especially for the Indo-Pacific. I mean, it's going to be a greater need, obviously. Secretary Kendall, it wouldn't be a hearing if I hadn't asked you about Space Command. You and I have talked about this quite a bit. Are we getting closer? I'd hate that this, we're getting, we're on the verge in our lifetime of a dangerous world. And, we might be fighting this thing from space if we don't watch it. And we want to make sure that we're doing the right things. I hope this thing doesn't get political. It looks like it is. We've been waiting for 2 years for a decision. Give me your thoughts on what's going on with the Space Command. General Dixon said in his last hearing here that he needed a decision. So what's your thoughts?
I don't have anything new to report today, Senator Tuberville. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to get a decision out as soon as possible, but I don't have any new information to provide.
None whatsoever? Are we even thinking about it, or is this, it's just in and out? I mean, it's...
I just don't have anything more to provide.
Well, do you think it's important for us to have a permanent base?
Yes.
Yeah. And, I think we all do. And Nebraska, who is on the list, number 2, and then San Antonio, number 3, I think we all are kind of sitting around waiting to see what's going to happen. But we sure would like to get this decision made and moved on down the road and have the opportunity to build on it instead of having guesswork. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Tuberville. Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for your service. We often talk about the role of bombers and fighter jets in national security, but our greatest strength as a nation is our people. The Senate approves thousands of military promotions every year, and typically this vote is a formality. But the senator from Alabama has weaponized a policy disagreement about abortion to politicize the military and place holds on all military nominations. This brings the careers of nearly 200 officers, people who have served their country for decades, to a screeching halt. General Brown, can you explain what steps does a colonel or a brigadier general have to go through before the president sends a promotion over to the Senate for approval?
Well, each one of those offers goes through a thorough review that actually starts initially in the Department of the Air Force, where we ensure there's no adverse information. That same process gets repeated through the Joint Staff, through the Office of Secretary of Defense, over at the White House before that member's record comes and is delivered to the Senate for promotion. So it takes several months before it actually gets to here to the Senate.
Okay, so you're not just sending these promotions over on a whim. Look like a good idea. I take it that these individuals are being recommended for higher rank because they are our military's best and they have proven themselves to the highest degree. Is that fair?
It does. It also it shows that they have future potential.
Future potential as well. Now, recruitment has been a challenge for most of the military services, but retention levels have stayed quite high. The Air Force currently retains about 90% of its people at critical decision points. That means that they complete a commitment, and the vast majority are choosing to re-enlist and stay with the Air Force. That's really good news. Secretary Kendall, does it worry you that if our men and women in uniform see that their promotions can get held up indefinitely because one senator has an issue with one DOD policy, that might hurt your ability to retain the best and the most qualified people in the Air Force?
Senator Warren, it does have an impact, definitely. I also want to mention it has an impact on families, too. We generally rotate people through the summer months, and people need to plan for that. They have to plan to get their children to schools where they're going to be established in their new homes. So there's a very personal toll that this takes as well. One of the things that motivates our people in terms of retention or not is how they feel that their families are being treated. Things like child care and education and health care are all very important factors. And we ask our military families to move multiple times during their career. It's something that they accept, but when their planning for that is disrupted, it has a very negative impact, and it definitely impacts on retention as well.
And do you think these families want to be made a political football?
I know that they do not.
So, Secretary Kendall, what is the national security impact of these holds for the Air Force?
The biggest impact is that people who should be coming into leadership roles don't arrive on time, so someone who's already there has to step up. Generally, people, if they're going to retire, they're still going to retire. So a junior person will step up and be acting for a period of time. Those people are limited in what they can do. They generally are not going to make any major initiatives or make any major changes because they know they're not going to be there very long. They expect that they'll be replaced very shortly. So they'll keep the trains running, but they're not going to move the organizations forward as much as they might be otherwise.
Well, the senator from Alabama is holding up promotions across all of the services, but I took a look at the Air Force nominees in particular, and one thing that was really striking to me is that the vast majority of them studied at the Air War College in Alabama. The state of Alabama has invested a lot in these leaders, and the senator from Alabama doesn't seem to care about that. So, Secretary Kendall, unlike many of the other services, the Space Force is meeting its recruiting goals. The Space Force is obviously still very young. These are defining years for your service. What are the readiness impacts of these holds on Space Force?
I'm not aware of any general officers that are being held for the Space Force at this time, but the same generic impact would happen there as would happen on the Air Force. The Space Force is meeting its recruiting goals because it's an exciting new opportunity for people, and it is relatively small and has relatively modest numbers that it's seeking.
Thank you very much. You know, holding the promotions of every single senior military nominee is not democracy, it's extortion. And this kind of extortion has serious consequences for our national defense. This actively hurts our ability to respond quickly to threats around the world. And as you point out, Secretary Kendall, this is really painful for military families who have already been called on to give so much. We need to lift these holds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ward. Senator Budd, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you all for being here, for those behind you and those you represent as well. In considering the senator from Massachusetts' remarks, Secretary Austin can solve this with a single stroke of the pen. So I was able to make that several weeks ago very clear. So change the policy, solve the problem. Secretary Kendall, based on the President's budget, the Air Force is requesting $2.9 billion, or about $317 million more than last year, to purchase 24 F-15EXs, and that's to replace the remaining C and D model F-15s. Does that sound about right? Thank you.
Yes, sir. It's replacing another increment of F-15Cs.
Yes, sir. Thanks. I think the Air Force budget makes that very clear, so again, appreciate you clarifying that. What's not clear to me is the Air Force plan for the F-15E Echo fleet, including the squadrons at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. I know Ranking Member Wicker was able to spend time there during his service, so it's a special place for many of us. The Air Force just completed major upgrades to the F-15E fleet, including replacing the outdated radars. This investment by Congress and the Air Force drastically improved the aircraft's air-to-air and air-to-ground targeting capabilities. Does that sound about right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. The Air Force is now in the process of adding the Eagle Passive Active Warning or Survivability System, or EPAWS, to these aircraft, which will offer improved offensive situational awareness and electronic attack capability. Correct?
Yes, sir.
So I'm now reading from page 261. This is a volume 2 of the Air Force's Aircraft Procurement Justification book, which states that F-15 EPAWS procurement plans have been aligned to the Air Force F-15E divestment plan and will result in 99 EPAWS modified aircraft. Now, one can read this to mean, and it's been reported that the Air Force plans to shrink the size of the F-15E fleet from 218 aircraft to just 99 aircraft by fiscal year 2028. Is that a correct interpretation of the Air Force divestment plan for the F-15E?
I'd have to check to confirm that, Senator, but I have no reason to believe it's not correct.
Thank you. I would ask you to check. And, Mr. Secretary, will you commit, after you check, to providing my staff a detailed briefing on the Air Force long-term plan for the F-15E within the next 2 weeks?
I can promise to give you that. I can't assure you that it'll be within 2 weeks, but I'll do my best to do that.
As soon as able. Thank you. So in addition to the F-15E divestment, you want to divest 32 F-22s, Block 20 aircraft, all of the U-2s, all MQ-9 Reapers, all RQ-4 Global Hawks of the Block 40 aircraft, and F-16 modernization would be cut. The F-15EX procurement objective was 144 aircraft, but now it's just 104 aircraft. Sound right?
Some of that is correct. I'm not sure about some other parts of it. We're not divesting all the MQ-9s, for example.
Okay.
And I believe your numbers on the EX were correct.
If you would check on those numbers, if you would, please. What is going to replace all these fighter aircraft and the ISR platforms? And the question really is, on what schedule?
Over the FIDIP, we do come down about 14% in total number of fighters. The problem we have is that the oldest fourth-generation fighters are just not capable against a threat. And when they go up against fifth-generation aircraft, they do not do well at all. We've got a lot of exercises that demonstrate that to us. The F-15E, which you're concerned about, we're going to be keeping that for some time. And as you mentioned, there's some upgrades still underway, but not with the numbers I think that you indicated. As far as you mentioned Seymour Johnson, I'm not aware of any near-term plans to change anything at Seymour Johnson, but we can give you more details on that when I give you the details that you asked for.
The question includes fiscal year 2028, if you would.
I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Overall, we are trying to move towards a next-generation set of capabilities. So F-35, NGAD to replace the F-22s, and F-15EX, and F-16s, more modern F-16s, are basically going to be the fighter fleet of the future. We're going to add to that the CCAs that we talked about earlier in the testimony.
Thank you. So I understand the divesting to invest concept, but I'm alarmed at the risk and the timing. Roughly, you have about 5,100 aircraft, and it's going to shrink to about a little over 4,400 by 2028. And most of those reductions are fighters. So my concern is that this represents an invitation to China to be even more aggressive. Any comments on that or concerns?
We look at total combat capability of the fleet, and we're increasing that as we buy fifth-generation aircraft.
Thank you. I yield to the chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Budd. Senator Rosen, please.
Well, thank you, Chairman Reed, and thank you for all of you for being here, for your service to the nation, and for everyone that works with you. And I want to build on what Senator Warren was talking about a little bit, about our military families, about how much they sacrifice, how much they do to really keep us safe and protect us, and it's important that we take care of them too. So Nellis Air Force Base, in Southern Nevada, there's a housing shortage. So General Brown, I've raised this before in committee several times, our wonderful junior enlisted airmen and airwomen stationed at Nevada's Nellis Air Force Base, they average only 12 months in the dormitories, being forced to move off base into very expensive private housing in the community due to these on-base housing shortage. And at Nellis, the dormitory master plan reflects a shortage of about 500 rooms. And the base has identified a need for 2 more dormitories. So I'm really disappointed that neither a new dormitory is in the Air Force's FY24 budget, or in the future year's defense program, or even on your unfunded priorities list. So, General Brown, how are you going to help our youngest servicemen and women here at Nellis, and of course other places around the country, provide more support for them to do their jobs and serve our country?
Senator, as you highlighted, it's very important we do take care of our airmen, and most importantly our junior airmen, because that actually impacts our retention. We do have 2 dorm projects that we're going through the initial stages for Nellis, in addition to money we're putting into renovating many of the dorms that already exist. Having been in Nellis several times, most recently in January, in the conversation on not only the dorm capacity, but how we work as well with the community to find affordable housing. One of the areas that I also highlight as we focused on not only affordable housing, but the difference in how we raise the basic allowance for housing for our junior airmen, it raised by about 21%. I mean, this is something we're paying close attention to, not only at Nellis, but I'd say around the Air Force, as we're seeing areas from a housing standpoint, how housing prices have gone up, but really working closely with the communities to try to find opportunities, particularly when we have a bit of a deficit in our dorms at specific locations. But we're going to continue to work to put more energy into the dorms at Nellis to do those renovations, but also the couple of dorm projects I mentioned.
And I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you and responding to our letters for improving the speed and access for the base housing allowance when servicemen, airmen do transition to off-base housing, getting that money quickly, faster. They are paid the least among everyone, and they're often the youngest, so it's very challenging. So I appreciate the cooperation and attention you've been paying to that. And then I want to move on to some of our military families that actually have children. They need child care. It's really important. Missions go 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? The military doesn't rest. And so Secretary Kendall, our airmen stationed at Creech Air Force Base, is just outside Las Vegas. They do the MQ-9 Reaper program, amongst other things. They struggle to find adequate child care because their shifts are often outside the normal business hours due to the drone programs and other things they do. It's 24-hour support. And the DoD's new in-home child care fee assistance pilot program, it was launched to help provide in-home child care solutions for our service members, especially in regions with high demand. I'm happy to see that you extended this pilot program to Las Vegas. However, I'm understanding now that the program has a lot of red tape, that it's really difficult requirements, and it essentially is rendering in-home child care reimbursement unavailable to Nevada's military families. So, Secretary, can you commit to me to work to make this program better for Nevada families? They have to show up at 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to complete the mission. We have to be there for their families. What can we do?
Senator, I couldn't agree with you more. I've made that commute. I've driven from Nellis out to Creech, so I know what those people have to do, and I can really appreciate the child care difficulties associated with having to provide child care near your home and then make that commitment and go back and forth. We have the pilot program, as you mentioned. I was not aware of the red tape issues until you highlighted them, but we'll take a look at that and see if we can do something to make it much more accessible to people. Child care is the problem that I hear most about from our families. There's a shortage of child care staff around the country. Mm-hmm. We're trying to address that with a number of initiatives to improve our pay and compensation, provide In the case of the Air Force, free child care for a staff member's first child and then deductions for the rest. We're working hard to have more in-home child care providers to increase the availability of child care. So we're doing a number of things in that area. But I will take a specific look at the problem you mentioned about the pilot program and see if we can reduce the red tape.
Perfect, thank you. We'll look forward to following up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Schmidt, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, from the outset here, ask unanimous consent to submit for the record this Washington Post investigative story entitled "Pentagon Buries Evidence of $125 Billion in Bureaucratic Waste" from 2016.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kendall, I'd want to ask you about this because you play a starring role in this article, as it turns out. There was a report that the Pentagon actually commissioned in the Defense Business Board, as you're aware, as you're nodding here, identified over $125 billion worth of bureaucratic waste. And you were instrumental in burying that report. And I want to ask you about this, but before I do, and you deserve an opportunity to sort of explain yourself here, but fundamentally in this report, or the reporting on the report that was buried, DOD employs more than 1 million people in back office positions, and we have 1.3 million troops on active duty. That's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. The report also laid out that there was a clear path to saving over $125 billion in the next 5 years by trimming that bureaucracy. The greatest contributors to the savings are early retirements and reducing services from contractors. But that $125 billion, whether it's $125 billion or some factor below that, is a startling number. And just to put that in context, that amounts to 50 Army brigades, 10 Naval Carrier Strike Group deployments, or 83 F-35 fighter wings for a full 5 years. I want to ask you, what was your role in this? And is there anything to be learned from this report that never saw the light of day?
The report definitely saw the light of day. It was published, and nobody tried to suppress it, Senator, so that's completely incorrect.
Well, there's some emails from you, actually, that you were very aggressive in making sure that this wasn't given any credibility.
It has no credibility.
Okay.
I'm very familiar with that report. It was a very amateurish effort. It essentially made analogies between the government and the Department of Defense and companies that were selected in the commercial world, which had no real valid comparison. And then it said that because these companies could save X% of their cost, therefore the Department of Defense must be able to save the same percentage. It was nonsense.
Okay, so when you were in that procurement role, you are now Secretary of the Air Force. I want to ask you, let's just say you're right. Let's say that it has no validity, which I don't believe, whether it's 100% or 20, whatever that number is. What are you doing right now as the Secretary to cut out waste? Are you doing anything? Have you identified anything? Have you done anything?
We've set a number of management initiatives in place to try to introduce well-defined metrics for each part of the Air Force, each part of the enterprise, all the different functional pieces.
Have you realized any savings from this? Have you realized any savings from this?
Yes, we have.
Okay. I'd like to follow up then to find out exactly what that is.
Certainly.
Okay. And the reason why I'm asking is we are clearly, whether you want to call it a pacing challenge or a chief adversary with China, they're not messing around. And I just don't think we have to have a sense of urgency, I think, in making sure that every dollar that taxpayers are putting forward, and I'm somebody that's going to be advocating for, an aggressive posture here, that we're not letting any of that go to waste. And sort of following up on that, in March, I sent a letter to Secretary Austin asking him some fairly simple questions about civilian workforce. There's recruitment issues. There's readiness challenges. And I was asking him specifically how many DEI-related positions exist in the Department of Defense. And I want to ask you, how many DEI positions exist under your purview?
I'd have to get you that for the record.
Okay, will you be responsive? Secretary Austin has not been responsive, so I want to just find out what we're dealing with here, and the number of jobs. And also I want to ask you, how many mandatory DEI training sessions were conducted last year?
I'd have to get that for the record also. Our DEI training sessions are prescribed by a law. I think they're in the NDAA from 2019, if I remember. They're prescribed certain numbers of hours in different aspects of our training.
Okay, we'd like to get those
Generally what we-
materials actually too. We've had a hard time actually getting those materials.
We can get that for you.
Okay, thank you. And then Secretary Kendall and General Brown, lastly, I do want to ask, I saw today actually it was reported that the Air Force announced that the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base will be fielding a new special operation wing that will offset the impact of the loss of the A-10 mission there. I know you mentioned the A-10 in your introductory comments, Mr. Secretary. You're aware that the 442nd Fighter Wing out of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri houses some of the best and most experienced fighter pilots and maintainers in the world, yet we and they have yet to learn what their follow-on mission will be once the A-10 is divested. Given the ongoing pilot shortage and recruitment challenges we have, it's important to ensure that the 442nd get a follow-on mission. Secretary Kendall, do you agree it makes sense to leverage those existing talents, the fighter aircraft experience, the fighter pilots, the maintainers at the unit in the 442nd as you divest in the A-10? Divest from the A-10?
Our approach to divesting the A-10 is to try to replace another fighter mission if possible, and if not, then a flying mission. And if we can't do that, there are a number of other missions that are very important to the department. We talked about electronic warfare here, cyber is another one, ISR, intelligence. All of those things matter. So in every case where we're taking aircraft out, we're trying to make sure that a viable long-term mission replaces that mission.
When do you expect to announce that follow-on mission for the 442nd?
I'd have to get that for you. I don't know when.
Okay, we're very interested in that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Schmidt. Senator Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, General Saltzman, good morning. Thank you for being here. For Secretary Kendall and General Brown, I want to thank you for your continued collaboration as we secure a long-term future for the Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson. I've lost count of all the meetings that we've had, but I think our work together has brought real progress, and I'm encouraged by the current plan to bring new, enduring missions to Davis-Monthan that would keep the base at the center of our national security for years to come, as it should be. The new plan would bring an additional search and rescue presence and brand new electronic warfare platforms to DM that are important as the Air Force modernizes. The electronic warfare platforms, which is the new Compass Call aircraft, would be entirely based at DM, and the new Special Ops Power Projection Wing would bring additional new flying missions and some exciting capabilities to DM under this plan. General Brown, can you comment on this wing's importance in the context of the Air Force's overall strategy?
Sure, Senator. Just as the name implies, the aspect of power projection. And with our soft force from Air Force Special Operations Command that will be part of the base, in addition to the electronic warfare capability from the EC-37B, helps us be able to execute that power projection aspect. I think the other beauty of coming to Davis-Monthan is being able to bring special operation capability out to the southwestern United States, and the range capability and the ability they're able to train in the western United States, not only in Arizona, but in other parts of the United States, will also help us with that power projection.
Yeah, thank you. We have, very unique kind of weather situation, combination of weather and ranges. And also, this plan does have important aspects for our national security. And importantly, it retains the same number of quality, high-paying jobs in Tucson. And I'm glad to see that the Site Activation Task Force has now begun its work at DM to make preparations for these new missions. And I know you requested some site and environmental review funding in the budget request. And for my part, I'll be working to ensure that that gets over the finish line in this committee, as well as strong funding to advance the procurement of our new electronic warfare aircraft for DM and other assets in this plan. Secretary Kendall, this plan's ambitious, and I support that, but bringing this new mission and modernizing the others has a lot of moving parts here. What assurances can you provide me that you will be able to manage all these elements and stick with the timeline?
I can assure you that we were paying a lot of attention to this and doing everything we can to assure that it happens as planned. I was just at Davis Mountain. We've got some great people there, and we want to make sure we do what we have laid out in order to support them.
And anything specifically that you're doing to avoid any potential delays?
I think we are working with all the affected organizations right now to make sure that that planning is in place. I know the special operations people in particular are leaning forward to try to be prepared for this. And we talked about the E-37s earlier and what's going on there. So I think we're in generally good shape, Senator.
So full transparency is very important for me. So could you please make sure you highlight any potential issues to Congress, to this committee, as soon as they are encountered? That would help us get through this as expeditiously as possible.
We'll do that. General Brown, are you aware of anything that's pending?
No particular issues. And having just finished the first site activation task force, I think we'll be able to identify if there's any critical aspects that we need your support on. But I'd also say we'd also appreciate the opportunity to meet with the community leaders as well. That happened roughly about the same time frame. So I think good dialogue, and we want to continue that dialogue and work very collaboratively to make sure we make DM successful.
All right, thank you. I look forward to working with you both through this process and making sure we stay on track. I also want to flag a totally separate issue in the Southcom region that I think could become a serious problem. So China's looking to sell fighter aircraft to Argentina, potentially use that sale to create a foothold for future military basing in the Western Hemisphere, and I think we need to be very vigilant on this. We can counter their pitch here by facilitating the transfer of Danish F-16s to Argentina. That's a possibility. This is not just a transfer of aircraft. You know, it has real geopolitical and strategic importance. And so I just want to make you aware of this and just get your thoughts. I'm already over my time, but I've had a series of conversations about this with U.S. Southern Command, with a number of our allies. And I think the Air Force has a real role to play here. And if I could just get another 30 seconds, if Secretary Kendall or General Brown can comment.
I'm aware of the case, Senator Kelly, and I agree with you that it's important. I think it's working its way through the interagency process right now, but I think there is an understanding of the importance of it for the reasons that you said.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Of course. Senator Scott, please.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Secretary Kendall, do you just want to talk about what you do, every day to try to save money and how the process works, and because I assume it's part of what you have to do every day, because you probably have a lot of requests. So how do you go through the process?
We try to discipline ourselves, obviously, about how we operate. Generally speaking, we are operating the current force at what I would call an acceptable level, and we look at things like sustainment and readiness and so on. There's no place that I can think of, frankly, where we are fat. The number that was mentioned earlier, if I could just find, it assumed there was a $25 billion saving per year over the 5 years to get to 125. If I could find $5 billion, I'd be thrilled. We had to work very, very hard to find the $5 billion that we put in for the operational imperatives. The Department of Defense is not sitting there with a lot of excess cash lying around waiting to be found. That's not the way we're operating. I don't think there's any part of the department that isn't operating on the edge of where it would like to be. Now, General Brown, General Saltzman may talk about that, but when you look at weapon system sustainment accounts, you look at facility sustainment, we are doing, I think, reasonably well by our people in terms of compensation. We've got the pay increase, and I don't think anyone should fault us for that. That comes first. But we are operating in a way which is designed to use our funds as efficiently as we possibly can. We are constantly looking for efficiencies and savings. But when we find them, there are many uses for those funds that are immediately available and of reasonable priority. So there isn't, the perception that there's a lot of waste in the department and there's money laying around to be found is just simply not valid. Yeah. I'd let my colleagues comment if they would.
You guys want to add anything?
What I find is we have more requirements than we have resources, and so
just like running a company. Same thing.
Well, same thing. And this is the part where the Secretary, myself, and General Saltzman spend a lot of time with our staff determining how best to apply those resources to get us to not only take care of our airmen, guardians, and their families, but to provide us the most combat capability that each of those dollars will buy.
Yep.
I would just add, it's a continuous process to scrub requirements, whether that's hardware, software requirements, whether that's personnel requirements, whether that's policy requirements. We're in a continuous evaluation of those. And one thing I'll give Secretary Kendall for is we don't show up to his conference rooms without data to support our decision-making process. And so I think that's been valuable as we look at different alternatives or different ways of doing our day-to-day business. We have to show up with data to make sure we get it right.
Thanks. Secretary Kendall, first off, I appreciate what you said about the A-10s, so hopefully we're making progress on that. I think it's the right thing to do for the country. Can you talk about Homestead? I guess there's rumors that there's an interest in closing Homestead. Is there anything happening on that?
I have not heard that rumor, Senator Scott. I'm not aware of any desire to close Homestead.
All right. If somebody would just call me and let me know, it's a big deal as you expect. It's a big deal for Florida, right? Next, could you guys just talk about, do you have adequate resources to deter, just two things if you want, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so two things. Do you have adequate resources to deter China, all right? And when you talk to your friends and try to explain why we should help Ukraine and why should be in a position to deter China and Taiwan, what do you say to them? I mean, the global order doesn't sound very interesting to people, so how do you say it to just a layperson?
The answer to the first question is yes, but we're being challenged. I have not seen as aggressive or as capable a strategic competitor ever, and that includes the Soviet Union. I had 20 years as a Cold Warrior. So we have got to stay ahead of China, and our deterrence in the region depends upon our relative capabilities. And China's been pretty smart about their investments and trying to attack what they see as our dependencies. As far as Ukraine's concerned, China is watching Ukraine. And they're watching to see if Russia can get away with naked aggression and if there's a united response against it that's effective or not. They're watching the economic consequences. They're watching how the alliance plays out in terms of its solidarity and other support. I have a litany of things that I think Xi Jinping, that I would like him to learn from the Ukraine experience. One is that the short war you expect may not be the war you get. One is that your military may not be as good as they are telling you they are. Another is the economic consequence of aggression may be more than you can stand. I hope those are the lessons he's getting, but we're not through with this yet. We have a ways to go. And I think it's admirable that the NATO alliance is now stronger rather than weaker. That is not what Mr. Putin expected to have happen, and we need to continue down that path. And it is definitely being watched by China very carefully, and we want them to get the right lessons from this.
Anybody else want to add anything?
Senator, I think we just take a look at history. You think about the global order that was in the interwar years and into World War II. Mm-hmm. Small events of any type of crisis can start a firestorm, and this is something we've got to pay attention to. And this is why it's important for our own security, for our economic security, and our national security, that we pay attention to what's going on around the world. And it's probably, as the Secretary highlighted, it's probably the most complex environment we've been in a number of years.
Just very quickly, I would add, as Secretary Kendall mentioned, that it's one of the asymmetric advantages of the United States that it can build a coalition of like-minded nations. It's a tremendous power, strength, and showing a demonstrated commitment to our allies and partners, and I believe China's taking notice.
Right.
Thanks, Senator Scott. Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kendall, during Operation Desert Storm, the Air Force fielded 139 fighter squadrons spread out across the entire service. 49 of those squadrons belonged to the National Guard. And according to Air Force numbers, the total fighter fleet has been reduced now to 81 squadrons, with the Air Guard only fielding 26 of those. That means that over the past 30 years, we've seen nearly a 50% reduction in Air Guard fighter fleet. And this comes at a time when global tensions are at their highest in 50 years, and as we just heard from your answers to the previous senator, the complexity is significant. We have a hot war in Eastern Europe. We have a looming threat of conflict in the Pacific. So bottom line, I'm concerned about the fact that we have a declining fighter plane fleet, and with a time when we need every single plane that we can possibly get our hands on, we have let our fighter fleet shrink significantly and are now continuing to reduce the number of fighters in order to, quote, divest to invest. As you're aware, Selfridge Air National Guard Base is home to A-10s that will be divested by the end of the decade with no replacement mission yet stated. You and I have spoken considerably about this issue and will continue to do that in the future. But my question is a little broader about procurement and actually having aircraft that will be stationed in various places and certainly related to modernization. So I have a specific question is how is the Air Force actually budgeting for the procurement of aircraft across the service necessary to ensure the full recapitalization of the Air National Guard fighter fleet? And what support specifically do you need from Congress in order to accomplish that procurement budgeting that you're working on?
Thanks, Senator Peters. Yeah, I was in the Pentagon for the first Gulf War, and what we had at the time was a legacy force essentially left over from the Cold War. So the numbers were quite a bit higher than they ultimately came down to be. The way we're budgeting is to try to balance the near, mid, and long-term capabilities of the Air Force. And what we look at is total combat capability. And what we're trying to get to is the next generation of capabilities as quickly as we can while we sustain the current force, which is adequate to meet our needs. The A-10 in particular is an aircraft that it's over 40 years old now. It was a fantastic aircraft in its day, but it's aging out, and we're going to have to replace it. And we're working with you and the other communities to try to do that in a way which has a minimal impact and preserve some of our capabilities. You mentioned the Guard. I've had an opportunity now to visit a lot of Guard units, including yours in Michigan. They're highly capable units, and they're very important and cost-effective part of the force. So we want to sustain the right balance between active Guard and reserve and have the right mix of mission capabilities. That mix is changing over time, and as war becomes more about information dominance than it does necessarily about kinetic power, we need things like ISR and intelligence and cyber and EW, electronic warfare. So we're trying to move towards that world and get that mix right. So the recapitalization of the fighter fleet, if you will, is one part of a much deeper and richer fabric of things that we're trying to do. We also, of course, have the Space Force, which introduces a whole new set of capabilities as well. And in some cases, space capabilities are going to be taking over for some of the traditionally air capabilities that we've had, areas like communications and surveillance, for example. So that's the picture that we're dealing with. And we're trying to get to the new capabilities that we'll want to field in greater numbers in the future as quickly as we can. That's a priority for us while we sustain a reasonable sized current fleet. Does that help?
It is. Thank you. Secretary, for more than 13 years, the Air Force has been investigating PFAS contamination at the former Wordsmith Air Force Base in Oscoda, Michigan. As a result of the contamination, the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services has issued 5 separate public health warnings to the community. Unsafe fish, venison, small game, as well as for unsafe shoreline, foam, as well as unsafe drinking water. However, there's still no cohesive cleanup plan in place, and the residents of Oscoda are understandably frustrated at what they perceive as being unnecessarily a dragged-out process on the part of the Air Force rather than dealing with the problem directly. And so instead of waiting for additional studies to be completed by either the Air Force or the EPA, and before seeing any progress, the community is right now seeking urgent action to stop the flow of PFAS-contaminated groundwater into the public waterways in the Oscoda area. These are called interim remedial actions, and there's a plan that has been submitted by the state of Michigan and local experts outlining exactly what needs to happen. So my question for you, sir, is can I get your commitment to taking these interim remedial actions now, without any further delays?
So I'd have to take a look at that plan. I'm not aware of the details of it. What we've been doing with PFAS is, first of all, making sure people have safe water to drink, and we've had a program to make sure that was the case. In some cases, providing bottled water to people. We've stopped the use of PFAS for the most part. We're getting it out of all of our installations where it's been a fire suppressant. We haven't found a replacement for PFAS to put out fires yet, aqueous firefighting foam, but we're still doing research on that. And as you know, I think EPA has come out with what we think will be a final criteria, 4 parts per trillion, which will then be the basis for cleanup efforts. And in the meantime, we've been trying to understand the extent of pollution around our bases so that we could fully appreciate the depth of that as far as a health hazard, but also so that we could do cleanup effectively. So we're making progress, even though it seems very, very slow. I'm not aware of the interim plan that you described, but we'll take a look at that, and if there's an Air Force responsibility there, we will meet that responsibility.
Would you make a commitment to look at that plan, that we can have another discussion in the near future?
I will look at it and have a follow-up conversation with you, yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your testimony. General Brown and Secretary Kendall, I want to just get your assessment. I'm going to do a little bragging here on behalf of the active duty and guard forces in Alaska with the spy balloons and the Russian Bear bomber incursions and the rescue mission and the search and rescue mission on some really challenging weather events where they're saving lives. Our Air Forces in Alaska have just been, in my view, doing exceptional work over the last several months. They do it all the time. These are hard missions, right? Going to intercept a, spy balloon or an unidentified aircraft in the middle of the night over the north slope of Alaska. It takes a lot of work in darkness and crummy weather. Can you talk to the importance of how they're doing, and including the J-Park training ranges and the future you see for them in the Air Force?
I'd go first. I've had a privilege to visit Alaska bases multiple times in my tenure, and I'm incredibly impressed with the quality and capabilities up there. And I also hear about missions people do, and as you mentioned, in extreme conditions, to do rescues and to do intercepts and so on. So it's an enormously effective part of our force. Alaska's strategic position matters a great deal too. You've got good access to a lot of parts of the globe that are very important to us, and your forces participate in some key missions both for homeland defense and to support the Indo-Pacific region. So Alaska and J-Park in particular is a range kind of capability that we don't have anywhere else in the U.S. So all very, very valuable to us. And we're investing in these capabilities. There's investments in our budgets to improve J-Park, to make it more effective as a training range. And I'm looking forward to coming up there in the summer and being there for one of those exercises.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General, do you want to talk, any lessons learned on, maybe you can't do it in the hearing right now, but our active duty forces were quite busy, the F-22s, the F-35s, with these Bear bomber incursions, which are kind of normal, but the spy balloons and things like that. Any lessons learned that you can reveal right now, or maybe in the closed session?
Senator, what I would highlight to you, and you've already addressed it in some of your comments here, is just the value of the teamwork across the force. Because it's not just the fighter mission, but it's also our maintainers that get the aircraft in some pretty tough weather conditions as well as our airborne early warning with the E3, and how that all that command and control comes together to be able to execute the missions. Part of that skill set comes from the day-to-day training you're able to get on J-Park, a very capable range that we continue to invest in, and so it's a combination of all those together that provide us that capability. That's in a very important part of the country.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to kind of a related question. This year's budget includes a request for 72 new fighters, 48 F-35As, 24 F-15EX Eagles. We have over 100 fifth-gen fighters in Alaska, F-22s, F-35s. In the event of a conflict with the PRC, probably most, if not all, those aircraft would be deployed. They're under the Indo-PACOM's control, currently Indo-PACOM commander's control. This would require other aircraft to backfill the Homeland Defense mission in Alaska, which we just saw was so important. How will the Air Force Fighter Acquisition Plan improve Homeland Defense, and what risks will the Air Force incur if the procurement timeline is interrupted, given that scenario I just kind of talked about?
Senator, what I would highlight to you is we've looked at not only the procurement aspect, but also how we would execute the mission. I do think we're on a good path for procurement with this particular budget. It's something we want to continue to pay attention to not only the aspect of the aircraft themselves, but also the other capabilities that support and complement those aircraft, whether it's munitions, whether it's command and control. As we have operational scenarios, that is the beauty of air power. The flexibility we'd have to do in order to move some of our fifth-gen capability in conditions to combat our adversaries, at the same time how we would flex our total force to take care of the homeland mission, homeland defense mission as well. So this is where I think we have pretty good capability to be able to be responsive in a crisis with air power.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, just a real quick final question for General Saltzman. General, Alaska is also the cornerstone of America's missile defense in terms of the ground-based missile interceptors at Fort Greely and the radar systems that we have throughout the state. Recently, NORTHCOM completed its testing of the long-range discrimination radar system at Clear Space Force Station in Alaska. Can you talk to the committee about how this LRDR system has dramatically improved our missile defenses and domain awareness, and is it on track the way in which you want it to be?
Well, it's a very important radar in a very important location. It's highly discriminating in terms of target. It produces high-fidelity tracks that enable our missile defense system and secure the homeland from missile threats. Day-to-day, it also will be capable of supporting the space domain awareness mission, which I'm heavily invested in. And so the number of tracks from that part of the sky is a significant contribution to our overall space domain awareness.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Senator Duckworth, please.
Thank you, and good morning to each of our witnesses. I had a very engaging 20 whole minutes, actually, thanks to the Subcommittee Chairman Kelly discussion on Air Force design at the Airland Subcommittee hearing last week. As the entire Joint Force reorganizes and modernizes, Congress has to play an active role in oversight to ensure that the DoD is equipped for competition with the best weapon systems and the most effective organization of our troops. The Marine Corps published a Force Design 2030 document, which provides a detailed roadmap and vision of what its future force will look like. The Navy published its Force Design 2045 document, which goes through its shipbuilding aspirations. And I understand from today's testimony that the Space Force is also working on a force design effort, though it doesn't sound like that has been completed quite yet. In contrast, the Air Force published its future operating concepts, which does not feature the level of detail that the other forces have articulated, that the other services have articulated. Mr. Secretary, I know that the Department of the Air Force has operational imperatives to help orient the two services' investments, but if neither service has an explicit roadmap for force design, the Air Force or Space Force, what is informing recruiting and retention goals or specific RTD&E investments? And Mr. Secretary, is your department truly organized for competition?
It's a great question, Senator. The short answer is yes, but. We have basically limited maneuverability over the next few years in terms of what the ultimate force structure will be. Mm-hmm. But there are some efforts. General Brown and I have talked about this several times, and I've had similar conversation with General Saltzman. We need to be thinking about the long-term future and what the future looks like given the strategic competitors that we have, particularly China. And as you can see from the initiatives we started with the operational imperatives, we're moving towards modernization that'll be effective against that threat, but that's a dynamic threat. It's constantly changing. It'll respond to what we do. So we need to think very carefully about the future, what our future posture might look like, and create some options at this point that will be fleshed out as we move further along. We also need to look at how we're structured. I've asked my scientific advisory board to take a look at this. The posture the Air Force has evolved into over time is one that was essentially derived from the kinds of operations it was conducting, which were largely counterinsurgency with a lot of deployments overseas for people and a certain kind of tactical combat operations. That's not what our future looks like. And so we have got to look at how We're training the R4 Gen, the F4 Gen model that General Brown is using is a piece of that to get us to a better cycle for how we utilize the force and how we prepare it for next more stressing operations. But we've also got to look at how we're structured to do acquisition. We're not transitioning science and technology as quickly into products as we should be, or as efficiently as we should be. So there are a number of things that we need to take a look at. And on my list of to-dos at this point in time is to work with my teammates here to try to define the structure we're going to need for the long-term strategic competition we're in. And that's the work that we really haven't completed yet. I'm very comfortable with where we're going over the next few years, but we need to posture ourselves for a longer-term competition.
So there will be some sort of a document in the future, because you understand we have to do our jobs here, right? And so at some point decisions are required to shape these investments going into the future. And for example, the Marine Corps says that they require 31 amphibious ships. In Congress, this committee can authorize and advocate for those ships and hold leaderships at all levels accountable. And I do think that Air Force and Space Force needs to work constructively with Congress to appropriately allocate the resources and measure its modernization success. But how can we do that if neither the Air Force nor the Space Force has an explicit modernization roadmap based on some sort of future-looking force design effort?
There's a well-known aphorism, Senator, that plans are nothing and planning is everything. We've started the planning work, but we don't have the plan yet. But I think I agree with you that it would be a valuable document to have to lay out where we're going to go. And we will be working on that for our own purposes, but I agree with you that it would be a valuable product for the Congress as well.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on this and keep at it, just so you know. I wanted to also talk about recruiting, retaining, and effectively leveraging the organic talent within the services. For example, we have the ability for service members to test out on a language and say, I'm a native Spanish speaker, I'm a native Thai speaker, I speak French, and you can actually get that designation by taking the language test. And then the force knows that you have those airmen, those guardians that have those resources, those capabilities. But I believe that we risk overlooking the skills of service members, particularly those in the reserve component who have critical digital skills from their civilian careers. And I introduced the Managing Active and Reserve Tech Talent Effectively Act, it's a mouthful, I know, to fix that. And my bill directly directs the services to establish career field policies and processes to identify members across the total force who have skill sets in advanced technology areas such as computer programming, coding, AI, ML. It gives the department discretion and flexibility to figure out the best way to do that. But my bill requires that the reserve component service members be able to use their skills and experiences from their civilian jobs to qualify for these military career fields. General Brown, General Saltzman, I'd like to hear from each of you about the benefits to your services that come from leveraging the digital skills of its total force service members, particularly those in the reserve component who have tech skills from their civilian careers.
They're very important, and there's a couple of programs that we're looking at to deal with this. One is I was out at DIU back in December entitled Gig Eagle, and it's an aspect of identifying those who have those particular skill sets that you can bring on for short periods of time to work through a complex issue because of their civilian expertise. The other part that we're also looking at is how we get greater visibility on their certifications.
Right.
And how we use that information for promotion boards and other areas, not just your academic degrees, but you're certified in areas that don't require a academic degree, how we have better visibility on those and how we track that particular talent with special experience identifiers so we can tap into and provide those opportunities for those outstanding service members that can help us in areas just because of the work they do in the civilian sector.
Thank you, Chair.
I agree, they're critical. In fact, they're so critical, I'm trying to make sure that the Space Force has a reserve, has the part-time workforce integrated into it so that we can continue to leverage it. One of the things I've found is that those part-time guardians, airmen now, guardians in the future, would be able to stay at the highest levels of those competencies because they're integrated into the commercial sector, and they can bring those skills readily in when we need them. So it's a critical effort that I support.
I mean, you need to know where all your MCSEs are, all your CCNAs are, and know how many you have and say, hey, I need that guy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Mr. Secretary, General Saltzman, General Brown, thank you for your testimony and for your service. At this point, let me, for the benefit of my colleagues, remind them there is a vote ongoing. We will reconvene at 12:15 in SVC 217 for the closed session. And with that, I'll adjourn the open session.